Well, good morning and welcome to the Blueprint for Managing Project Labor Risk webinar. This is Anthony Ricciardi, and on behalf of Allied Construction Industries, we have a great program. First, some housekeeping tips. Please have your mics muted, cameras on. Please feel free to use the chat feature, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. That's a great time to turn your mics on. And now, Robert Volkman, retired from Procter & Gamble and a consultant and educator to the construction industry, will introduce our featured speaker. Bob?
Hi, Anthony asked me to talk a minute about why an owner is concerned about labor risk on a project. And it turns out that on major industrial construction projects, labor is the risk. Productivity has always been a factor in how much a project costs, how long it takes, et cetera. But in a workforce shortage like we're experiencing now and expecting to experience for many years, labor becomes a major risk to all projects. When contractors aren't able to staff their project with qualified experienced journeyman workforce, they're not able to bid competitively. Sometimes they don't bid at all because they are at their current capacity and not able to staff additional projects. So our costs go up. Our schedules get longer as contractors aren't able to staff projects at peak levels. Our quality goes down because of the experience of the journeyman working on our projects, and our safety incidents go up because we're working basically with a less skilled, less experienced workforce. So everything goes bad when we have a workforce shortage, and most people are expecting the current workforce shortage to extend because of the continued retirement of baby boomers like myself. So you should expect this to be an issue for many years. It's going to take a major effort. So in introduction to Daniel, I've known Daniel for 15 years. And all the time during that period, in addition to many other responsibilities, he's been focused on the workforce issue in the construction industry. First with the Construction User Roundtable, which is an international association of owner or construction organizations, mostly industrial, but in all areas, and a global organization also. And then most recently as the CEO of the Construction Industry Resources, with their major products, which I'm sure he'll describe later in the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Daniel. You're in good hands. He's probably the current best expert on workforce risk and workforce availability in the United States. And it's all yours.
Hey, how's it going, Jeff?
All right, good morning. Well, thank you, Bob. And
Yeah.
with a setup like that, I don't know, that's tough, but I appreciate it, and looking forward to spending some time with you all this morning. Thank you for taking a few minutes this morning to talk about this issue, and we'll go through a whole lot of information here this morning. I think it'll be pretty interesting if you're not familiar with it. And even if you are familiar with it, the updated information, I think, will be enlightening as well. So as was already noted, the topic this morning is the owner's blueprint for labor risk management. What does an owner need to do in order to address the risk that is evident and challenging on every project, it seems, and perhaps not every project to the same level of severity. Certainly the challenges in some regions, some areas, some projects is more acute than others. But overall, the challenge is pretty significant. And one of the things I think we ought to start with is just by addressing what risk problem actually needs addressing. Certainly, we have a tremendous amount of labor uncertainty. It's a major problem. It's an industry disruptor. And most of the time, we end up focusing on cost and schedule because most projects are cost or schedule driven. And so depending on your perspective of those projects, you might respond accordingly. And for example, if your project is schedule driven and you're having productivity issues, you're probably more inclined to just throw bodies at it, get the project done. Don't worry as much about the cost side of it because it has to be done within a certain time frame. But regardless, cost and schedule are major impacts on projects. Those tend to be financially oriented. Safety incidents, of course, are human impacts. But all of this sort of relates back to the labor risk that has to be addressed on a project for the project to be executed successfully. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. But before we jump into it, I want to set the stage a little bit, just kind of give us some perspective on what's happening in the marketplace. And this slide looks a little bit busy, but I'll take a minute here to set it up. And I think you'll find it's actually fairly self-evident what's going on here. So let's start with the fact that what we typically do through Construction Industry Resources is provide an annual report that outlines what we expect to see happening in the marketplace out through some period of time. In this case, we've been going out through about 2030. Obviously, if you get out farther than 4 or 5 years, you can understand somewhat directionally what's going on, but it's hard to know with precision what's going to be happening. But at least understanding directionally gives you more information in order to be effective at planning. And so that the line that the hyphenated line, the dashed line that you see at the top of the screen is the spending forecast that we released in February of this year, pre-COVID. The light blue shaded area down below, you only see a little bit of it because it's obviously behind the darker shaded area, but that's the demand for craft workers associated with that spending. Before COVID hit, we were at the longest growth period or growth expansion period, more than 10 years that we'd ever seen. And so it was expected that there was going to be a downturn. And in fact, you see on that dashed line, you see where there was a downturn expected, but then we expected the marketplace to recover with a pretty significant amount of vigor. Well, of course, COVID came and that changed the marketplace tremendously. And what you see then reflected is in that dark line, that dark solid line underneath the dashed line, that is the new forecast for spending across the United States as a result of not just the pandemic, but also oil prices, the impact on the oil markets. So we're seeing a downturn. We're in that now. It's going to take a little bit to come out of it, but we're already seeing that recovery happening. And we see some growth happening, some significant growth happening. A lot of pent-up demand will be occurring. Farther out, there's more uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen with China at this point in terms of trade. We don't know what's going to happen yet in terms of this pandemic. So it's hard to look out too far. We're constantly trying to look forward and see what's going to happen. But going forward, beyond the next 2 to 4 years is a little bit hazy at the moment. But regardless, we do see some significant return, not only occurring, but that will continue to occur. That dark shaded area at the bottom is the demand associated with that dark blue spending line. So a tremendous amount of demand still for skilled workers, even during the downturn. We've heard the president and Congress talking about an infrastructure bill for quite some time. So that teal colored line at the top of the screen there, top of the chart, is what happens if an infrastructure plan were to come to fruition. Of course, we've been talking about this for quite a while, so it's hard to know if or when, but it does need to happen. And so there's an expectation that it will happen. This is based on roughly $1 trillion of additional spending over a 10-year window of time, which is the way these plans typically work. And as you can see below that light gray shaded area on top of the dark gray shaded area, that becomes the additional demand that will be required as a result of that additional spending. So I think we set the stage a little bit for spending for construction. By the way, this is all non-residential, so this would include all industrial, but also all non-industrial: roads, highways, schools, bridges, water, sewer, hospitals, all those types of things. The red line then, it looks like a straight line, but it's actually not. It's curved just a little bit. That's actually the supply line. Supply line in this case is below, obviously, where it needs to be in order to ensure a sufficient amount of demand. And it's not surprising because we've been experiencing shortages across the U.S. for quite some time. In fact, I think we've tended to become somewhat complacent to it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes, but I think we've become somewhat complacent to it because the sky never really seems to fall, but yet the problem becomes greater and greater. And so the issue here when we show this number is, you might say, well, yeah, but isn't the number of these skilled workers higher than this? It is. And so what this red line here reflects actually is the adjusted amount of labor to reflect the types of workers that could do these kinds of projects. We don't have necessarily a shortage of bodies. What we do have is a shortage of skill. And so that's really what we're going to try to address this morning, is the challenge in the skill levels. And Bob referred to that. And of course, if you're a contractor on this call, you'll have some recognition of this challenge as well, particularly during the pandemic, where between unemployment and the additional payment that the government is making to workers, it might be more profitable actually to not even work. And so that's become a challenge. So we don't really have a problem with bodies so much as we have a problem with skill. This is across the whole U.S. Obviously, in different regions of the U.S., the problem is more acute than in other regions of the U.S., but this is looking at it from a macro perspective. I'm going to drill down, now that we have some perspective on this chart, let me drill down to just the Southeast. I'm not going to go into all the same detail. You'll see a lot of common patterns, although not identical, but a lot of common patterns. And the reason I focus here on the Southeast as one of the regions to talk about is because so much of what's happening in the U.S. From a construction perspective is happening within this 13-state region. For us at the CLMA, that's what we call the Southeast. It's a fairly big region. We break it down into micro regions: the Gulf Coast, the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast, as well as the Gulf Coast going all the way around to Florida. And those, from an industrial construction perspective, are driving a significant amount of what you see here, both in terms of spending and demand. What's notable here is the red line shows an even greater imbalance of workers. And again, this isn't based on necessarily the number of bodies. It's really based more on the skill level. And so when you look at the skills that are required to build these projects, it's really where you begin to see a significant disconnect between what's needed and what's available. That's the problem that we really need to address. We could go into a lot more detail on this, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background on the marketplace, what's happening as a result of the pandemic and what we see happening going forward, and how that sets the stage for our discussion. So let's now talk about the attrition of the workforce. What you see on this chart is, on the left-hand side, let's assume a new entrant comes into the workforce this year. It will, depending on the individual, depending on the craft they may be training for, there's a lot of factors, obviously, that's involved in this, but when that worker comes in, it's going to take a few years to get them to a minimal level of competency, particularly if you've recruited them out of a job or a profession that has nothing to do with construction. So it takes time. And then it takes another maybe 3 to 5 years to become competent and experienced, productive on the job. And again, this varies depending on the particular discipline, depending on the particular individual. And then it takes another several years in order to get that person to become a seasoned professional. So this process is challenging. It takes time in order to make this happen, to get a worker from a new recruit to a seasoned professional. But when you look at the charts above, you can see that the clock, the calendar is working against us. The next 2 years, about a 16% retirement, 22% over the next 5 years. And by the way, these are not sort of random projections. Within the CLMA database, we're actually collecting information on the labor workforce directly out of payroll. So we're looking at actual birth dates and then applying a typical or expected retirement age in order to understand what these attrition trends are going to be. 2029, the last of the baby boomers turned 65 years old, right? 2030, 34% is gone, and by 2035, so roughly 15 years out, about 47% of the workforce is gone. Now, this is not the entire workforce. As I note up in the title of this slide, it's the highly skilled workers. And so these highly skilled workers are really, in this particular chart, they reflect 13 or 14 different crafts: boilermakers, welders, pipe fitters, instrumentation techs, electricians, iron workers, and so on. These become the workforce that are the most difficult to go from a new recruit to a seasoned professional. It just takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. So you can see the challenge we have is pretty tremendous, and we're way behind the 8 ball in terms of recruiting and replacing these workers, and attrition has been outpacing growth in our industry. So let's talk a little bit more about the challenge. And I tend to look at these challenges in terms of symptoms versus a root cause. We typically are addressing symptoms, and that may be a labor shortage, maybe the productivity issues that Bob talked about in his opening, schedule, rework, budget, safety. All these, in my opinion, are symptoms of the challenge. Yeah, they're pretty significant, and they cause enormous pain on our project financially and otherwise, but these really do tend to be, in my opinion, the symptoms. And one of the big challenges we have is simply that our industry does not have an effective measurement opportunity or tool or process in place in order to develop the kind of metrics and benchmarking to drive improvement. And so when I consider what the root cause is, I would say it's leadership. Within our industry, I think that we have got to address the issue of leadership primarily by owners, because owners ultimately are the ones that own the projects. They have the checkbook. They're the ones ultimately impacted by whatever's happening. And so it's not to say that it doesn't impact suppliers and labor providers, contractors, et cetera. But the owner really is the one that's most impacted. And so I believe if owners were really to step forward and lead in this area, we could address this challenge, and we could address it in a significant way. So let's explore that. First of all, let me make the case for change. I think there are three key points to make here. One, transformational change is needed. Two, there's a model for the change. And three, there's a business case. So we're going to talk about each one of these. But I think in every case, you still come back to the fact that leadership is essential if we really want to drive change in our industry. So the first case is that transformational change is needed, the first point to make. So I don't know how many of you may be familiar with this chart, but let me just kind of set it up here real quick. This is a research project by Construction Industry Institute, CII. It was done in collaboration with CURT, CLMA, our organization was also part of it, NCCER. A lot of owners and contractors were involved in this. And the purpose of this research was to identify what impact labor shortages will have on the construction market going forward in the future. Is there, in fact, the title of this, as I recall, was, is there a demographic cliff that will impact labor and impact project performance? And the answer is yes. And so if you look at this, we broke things out into 3 categories: no difficulty, slight, moderate to severe. But if you remember, prior to COVID, prior to the economic circumstances we're in now, 75 to 80% of the contractors put themselves in that moderate to severe category. And that's based on ABC, AGC, Dodge, all kinds of surveys in the marketplace. Contractors were saying that they were having a pretty significant amount of challenge staffing their projects. And even when they staffed them, what kind of competency and quality they were getting. And so the average then, in terms of cost, budget impact, was 17.3% increase, about 23% longer schedules. Now you can say, well, we can mitigate those challenges, and yes, you can. There are ways to mitigate cost and schedule challenges. The problem here is that whenever you saw cost and schedule challenges like this as a result of labor risk, the safety incidents came with it. It was a hand in glove type of an effect. You didn't get one without the other. And so if we're going to be serious about safety, we have to be serious about addressing labor risk. You can't do one in isolation of the other. That's not to say there are no incidents where those may have been isolated. But when you look at the body of research, the overwhelming evidence says that if you have one, you have all of them. So the current workforce is not working. Transformational change is needed. Tinkering around the edges on those symptoms that I talked about just won't get the job done. We've got to do something dramatic. One of the key things that we need to do that's transformational is just, as a construction industry, follow the advice that we gave ourselves. And that is that owners should only do business with contractors who invest in the workforce. Now, this recommendation goes all the way back to the mid-'80s at the Business Roundtable. And as Bob mentioned, I work with not only CIR, but also with CURT. And CURT used to be part of the BRT. So this is a recommendation that goes back a pretty good distance. It's been reaffirmed by CURT. It's been reaffirmed by CII in that restoring the dignity of work research. So we've said we should do this, but we don't seem to do it. And one of the things that I want to point out here is that this idea of owners only working with contractors who make this investment is not intended to be in any way pejorative or punitive. In fact, it's just the opposite. The whole goal here is collaboration. It's owners getting into the rowboat with the contractor and pulling in the same direction. And you may recall that we have a model for doing that, right? And that model is the second point, the model for change. It's safety. If you look back at where safety was in the late 1980s, it was pretty bad. Now, this is CURT and CII data. We consider ourselves among the best in terms of safety performance and safety improvement. But when you look back at the end of the 1980s, the CURT and CII combined TRIR, total recordable incident rate, was about 7.19. Now we look back in that now and say, how is that even possible that it was that bad? But it was. It just wasn't good. And if you remember, that's when owners began saying, okay, look, enough's enough. We're going to be safe no matter what. This is not just a business imperative, it's a moral imperative. We have an obligation to ensure everybody goes home at night with all their limbs and digits and uninjured, and particularly their wife. So you combine OSHA requirements, and then you combine that with what owners began saying, which is that if you want to bid on our projects, if you want to work on our projects, you have to be safe. You began seeing change, yet it still took about 15 years to get below 1. This doesn't change overnight. look how precipitously that improvement occurred. And yet it still took 15 years to get below 1. You move up now. I just got the new data that we just completed for the 2019 data. So that is now dropped over on the far right from 0.33 to 0.27. So moving in the right direction, because 0.33 was moving in the wrong direction. But we're doing well. We're doing well, right? But can we do better? Regardless, there's a model for change. And that model is predicated on owner leadership. Owners saying, this is the way it's going to be, and we're going to do this together. And it happened that way. Now, if you look at that, when owners started effecting this change, they didn't start kicking contractors to the curb, and they shouldn't do that. But what they started doing is saying, this is our expectation, and the change has to start, and has to start now, and it has to be dramatic improvement. And I think one of the key things to think about here is that it took time for this to happen, but the owner role, the owner leadership in this unleashed innovation. And so now there are ways of being safe that were never thought of in the past. And that's the kind of innovation we need in workforce development as well. Let's look at the third case, the third key point I wanted to make, and that's around the business case. So there's a lot of research that's behind this, and I'm not going to go into all the detail. I would encourage you to read this research in order to understand it more fully. But here's the bottom line. If an owner requires a contractor, or a contractor were to do it even without the requirement, but if the contractor were to invest about 1% of the labor budget on every project into training, it produces a dramatic effect. And the research indicated that it would be around $3 for every dollar invested. What you're seeing on the screen right now, obviously it's not associated with a particular project that you can identify. It was a total installed cost of $250 million. It was about a 30-month project. But we modeled this on an actual project for one of the owners that we work with. And you can see what the average there is for 5 key areas. But overall, a cost benefit ROI of about $6.75 for every dollar invested, with a low of $4.42 and a high of over $9. There's a real case to be made here for training. It's not just a good idea from a cost and from an advancement of the workforce perspective, but it produces a real benefit from a cost perspective back to the owner. And this is particularly important when you're talking to procurement within the organizations, because they tend to look at this and say, well, if you're going to require 1% of that budget, the labor portion of that budget, to be invested in training, obviously that's going to flow back to the owner. Yes, it will. But if it flows back to the owner, can the owner then expect there to be an ROI that makes it worth it? So is it better to absorb that cost up front, or is it better to absorb it at the back of the project where you have less control and you're dealing with things like schedule and safety and rework and productivity and all those kinds of challenges? Well, I would submit it's better to absorb that cost up front where you have some control. And that's what we're going to get into more detail here about in just a moment. So the business case for training is solid. On average, if you were to look at both capital and maintenance projects, this research showed that there's a tremendous percentage of improvement, particularly in the area of safety. If you look at injury, that injury line, a tremendous level of improvement that there's an opportunity to realize as a result of this. And again, the research suggested it was about a $3 ROI. The experience is proving to be greater than that. One more thing before I move on to the solution, and that is I want to talk, we focus a lot in our industry on safety, we should. So this is the same chart I showed you before, right? And so what I want to do now is illustrate how safety improvement can happen as a result of workforce training. And we tend to not think about this because we tend to think of safety training in order to improve safety. But how is it that workforce investment can improve safety. Whoop, wrong way. Well, again, let's go back and look at the fact that we had owners who began requiring that safety become a preeminent goal of every project. And then we had the research I was just showing you, RT231, which showed that there was a minimum of a $3 ROI that was achievable for every dollar invested. And that translated into improvement in productivity and rework and turnover, and in particular, safety. So when that research was done, what if we had followed the advice of that research? What if during this period of time, we had actually implemented the recommendations of that report and began making that investment in workforce development and training? Well, what the research says is that we should have realized, rather than about a 50% increase year over year, as we saw in 2018, but overall about a 13% improvement in TRIR. So we could have been significantly more improved had we been doing this. And in fact, if we had done it on a consistent basis across all projects, not just one project at a time, we could have seen an even greater level of improvement. Now, it's important to look at this. We did a study of this data with one of our big owners. Actually, it was ExxonMobil. And ExxonMobil wanted to correlate this data back to their internal tracking of safety. And one of the things that ExxonMobil saw was, as they were trying to, well, let me back up. They were trying to figure out, how do we get, and they were, I can't remember their exact safety performance, but it was around, let's just say it was 0.25. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was pretty good. And they were trying to figure out, how do we get from that, let's say 0.25 down to 0? What are the incidents that are happening in that area that can be addressed? And so they broke them they put them into two buckets. One was what amounts to slips, trips, and falls. So this is the kind of activity that's happened simply because we're human. I didn't get enough sleep last night. When I came to work, I was tired, and so I tripped, or I mishandled something that happens simply because as a human, certain things may not be avoidable. But then the other things were the things that could have been prevented had we had more effective training and workforce investment. And so they estimate that 50% or more of those incidents were as a result of training. And it was things like, if I'm trained more effectively as a craft worker on the tools, I would know that I need to adjust my body or adjust the grinder so that those sparks aren't hitting me directly and creating a potential safety incident. So those types of things, which become improvements as a result of rigorous training, which is differentiated then from safety training. And so this is one of those areas that we've begun to see within these organizations as we try to get to 0, where training comes as a result of or safety improvement comes as a result of rigorous training. So again, owners, let's talk about the solution. Owners are the essential solution here. Their leadership is essential. And as this crisis is returning, we are, as the market begins to grow again and improve again, we've got to do something to address it. So the labor risk management program was designed to deal with this. It's transformative, it's leadership driven. It's really nothing new. It's predicated on the CURT recommendation that I showed you earlier, that owners should do business with contractors and collaborate with them in the area of workforce investment. It's predicated on CII research, which says that if you invest in the workforce, it's not a cost center, it's actually an investment, and it returns a significant amount of value and dollars back to you for the investment. The CWDA is the tool by which we actually are able to measure workforce development and training and performance. And I'm going to talk to you about that here in just a moment. And then we have a database. We have an analytics platform that captures this information and translates it into risk information in order to better understand how to plan a project very early. So let's look at these elements for success on a project. If you consider the timeline. So first of all, owners have to commit. They have to be serious about doing this. This is the leadership I was talking about. So if an owner commits to the labor risk management project process, it has the opportunity to succeed. Then you need to get the EPC or the GC engaged in the process. They too have to make a commitment in the process, but they have to be engaged in it. Oftentimes, the owner obviously is engaging them. They are engaging the subcontractors. So you need not just the owner to commit to this, but you need the general contractor to do the same thing. And then the contractors are all, whether it's an EPC all the way to all the subcontractors, begin submitting their information into the process in order to be able to understand what is the risk profile, not just of the contractor, but of an individual project early in planning. And it's the things that we were talking about: productivity, forecasting, supply and demand, cost of labor, all these different things go into that platform. The labor risk index, and I'm going to show you that here momentarily, is designed to capture this information, translate it into a score, risk profile, to help you analyze the risk on a project in order to mitigate that risk. And then taking that data and using it to continually improve. So this is not a process that happens one time. This happens on every project. It happens for every contractor. It's a continuous process. In the same way that on safety, we evaluate every time for every project in order to ensure that we are minimizing our safety risk, we have to do the same thing as it relates to workforce as well. So that labor risk index I was talking about is the LRI is a risk profile for a project. So what we've done is we've developed this capability of being able to take, in this, for right now at least, 5 key areas: safety performance, and you see those at the bottom of the screen: safety performance, labor shortage risk, labor productivity, quality, so rework, defects, and so on. And then that CWDA score, which is the measurement of workforce development and training. So we're taking all of this data that's coming in, we're creating a risk profile, and that's that LRI score you see there of 1.06. And then we're benchmarking that against the industry overall and then against peers. So that as a project planner, very early in the project life cycle, you were able to see specifically what is the risk that a contractor brings to this, and what is the risk of the project. So you have different risk profiles, but now you're understanding, what is my total risk on a project as I move forward? What do I need to be doing in order to minimize that risk? And so that's what this is providing an answer to. And so if you're trying to understand what the LRI is, think of it in terms of what FICO is to credit and lending. You have this ability with FICO score to understand somebody's score, whether it's a business or an individual, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Below that, maybe their score is a little bit low because they had a sickness, and maybe they were in the hospital, and they missed a few mortgage payments, and it looks bad, but it's understandable what happened. Otherwise, they have a really good credit risk profile. And so it's important to not just look at that overall score and then make an assumption, but to drill down. And so we have that capability in here. We don't have time to go into it right now, but we have that capability of going down to understand the total risk profile in order to ensure that you're not discounting good performers simply because something happened in one circumstance or so that may have impacted that. So this LRI is to project labor risk what FICO is to credit lending and what EMR is to safety performance. It doesn't tell the whole story at that highest level, but you can drill down and figure out exactly what you need to know. I also want to talk here about the CWDA. The CWDA is Contractors Workforce Development Assessment. It's an online tool that's designed to measure the contractor's workforce investment. And so this was what I was talking about earlier when I said within the area of safety, we have a tremendous amount of data over time to show where we were and where we are and how we got there. What did we change along the way in order to improve that? But in the area of workforce development and training, We don't have that. And so what we're doing here is we're measuring a contractor's investment in the workforce, their investment in training, their journeyman to apprenticeship ratio, their performance certification of the workforce. And so there's an online process that goes through here. And again, it provides that CWDA score, benchmarks it against the industry, benchmarks it against peers, and gives you then the ability to be able to share this with owners or with GCs, EPCs in order to more effectively bid on projects and show your capability. And so there's a tremendous amount of benefit that comes from the CWDA. Benchmarking in particular has an enormous amount of value because it allows you to see where you stand relative to the marketplace, and then it helps you understand where you need to be headed and how to get there. And so this provides an industry-wide metrics capability for understanding workforce development and training. Helps you improve project outcomes for owners, pre-qualification and decreasing labor risk. It helps contractors improve operational excellence and get it and increase their ability to be able to bring in a workforce, get them trained, and then deliver that skilled workforce on a project. Having a competent workforce is essential. And so we want to make sure that that workforce is as well trained as it could possibly be. And contractors need to be able to rely on the owners to support them in this process. Contractors already have pretty thin margins that they're operating with. So to add one more thing to a contractor without the support of the owner becomes very challenging. But I think if we were to get owners to lead on this, collaborate with the contractors, we have a model for the success that can be realized. We see it in safety. We have a business case for making this happen. And so when you look at this whole labor risk index, again, you can drill down as deeply as you need to. It's not just in the area of workforce or of workforce training, the CWDA score, but again, it's in the area of safety, of understanding the labor market. So when you're planning a project early, understanding the labor market, understanding what are the other projects in the area, like I was showing you earlier in this session. What are the other projects in the area that are demanding this labor that I need as well, that we have to compete against? Productivity, quality, all those kinds of things are built into this to help you understand risk, give you the predictive analytics that allow you to plan more effectively. So when do you implement this? Well, as early as possible is the ideal. Certainly by FEL2, we believe the LRM implementation needs to happen because this is when key decisions are being made on the project. Are we going to modularize? What's our contracting strategy going to be? What's the risk profiles of the contractors that we are looking at? How are we going to select them? How are we going to use the metrics and the benchmarking to make a good decision for selecting our contractors? And so this is why there's high value for the owner in that early planning, risk information, but it's also very valuable for the contractor to be doing the kinds of things that allow them to demonstrate a good score. And we're seeing owners start to adopt this, and I'm encouraged by that because that shows owners are starting to get serious about trying to address it, not just trying to do the same things. So these early planning stages of a project are essential for when you would implement the LRM program. And even if you're not doing the entire program, just doing the CWDA is a huge milestone and a huge step forward in terms of improving project outcomes. Can the CWDA, the LRM, be executed later in projects? Yes, it can. It's not ideal. Once contracts are let, it becomes very difficult to go back and reopen those contracts in order to do this. We are working with some owners who are looking at doing that, but obviously there has to be a tremendous amount of collaboration between the parties for that to happen. It's not ideal. In an ideal world, this would be done in the early planning stages, because that's when you are most able to impact the planning process and the project outcomes. So the last thing I wanted to show you then is one more point of this business case. I showed you this slide earlier, right? Except the difference is that on the first slide, when I showed it, I was showing you a single project. That ROI reflected what happens when one owner implements rigorous investment in workforce development and training on one project. So implementation of this on a project has value. However, in this case, what we're looking at is continuous training. So this is what happens when when everybody, all the owners, all the contractors within a particular region or in the marketplace are doing this. You see this in the area of safety. If a worker is on one project for, let's say, for ExxonMobil, you know that those workers are being trained. There's a certain expectation. The contractors have an expectation. And if they go over and start working for Lyondell, or they come over and start working for another hospital or whatever it may be, you know that training is continuing. There's an investment, there's an understanding that training is both a moral obligation and a business imperative. And so that is happening continuously. The same thing, when applied to workforce development and training, produces an even greater ROI, as you can see here. In fact, this ROI is roughly $2 on average greater for every dollar invested than if one owner does it on one project. So there's value. You need to make sure that it's not just an owner doing it, a contractor doing it, but that across the marketplace, everybody is doing it. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish here by advocating for the owner leadership on this, because when the owner leads, the industry will follow that lead. Because the owner is ultimately the one that's impacted, and they're ultimately the one who is absorbing the cost of labor risk challenges on projects. So thank you for giving me a few minutes this morning to share this with you. I'm happy to take questions, and let me open it up for that at this point.
Anybody has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them out loud, or you're more than welcome to share them in the group chat as well.
I don't have a question. My name is Marnie Durham from Butler Tech, but I do have a possible solution. I'm wondering if it's appropriate to share that at this time.
Well, from my perspective, absolutely. I'm interested.
Okay. I'm with Butler Tech, and we have secondary as well as adult ed programs, everywhere from precision machining to manufacturing to construction to mechatronics. And of course, as you can imagine, all of our students are sought after actually during their learning process, not just after they graduate.
Yeah.
But I was introduced to a model from a team that I'm working with right now that seems to work for everyone involved. It's just a matter of getting people on board. And the model consists of, if we have the manufacturers of the equipment and machinery to allow Butler Tech to use our spaces as showrooms, this is how it works. Let's say that we have a high bay at Butler Tech, and we would put the flooring in, the electric and paint and do all of that work. We would hire the instructor, and the companies would bring in their machinery and materials needed to train students, and they use it as a showroom. So they can bring customers in to look at the machinery being used by students, so you know it's user-friendly. And what happens is customers buy that product, and then they also would like to usually hire the students that are working on all these different machines. And it's a win-win for everybody, because what we struggle with is trying to find relevant machines that are up to date and are being used by all of the companies. So it eliminates that problem because we're a public school. Those machines come in, they're new. There's actually competition on the floor between the different machines. And then students win because they're using all of this different materials. So they are, you know, more likely to get hired because they have experience. But it really solves the problem that you've just described of how do we get skilled workers that are using updated materials to be seen and heard where no one's losing money. And there was a center run by Haas out in Greenville that I went to see. And we're currently working with GE Aviation, TechSolve, a bunch of different companies on a project called Quantum Leap that is the whole premise for this project. And it's more centered on additive manufacturing right now. And because we have a bioscience center and land out in that area, that's one of our sites. But I'm just interested in everyone's opinion or feedback if that could be a solution.
Well, maybe someone else has something to say about this as well. I'll just take 30 seconds to say I do think that that presents a good solution. I think that helps illustrate some of the innovation and good thinking that happens when we get serious about trying to address it. One of the questions that we have, or one of the things that's addressed within the CWDA relates to what you just said, which is asking the contractors what they're doing in terms of bringing in the suppliers and vendors in order to help them train their workforce to ensure that the tools and equipment and so on are being used correctly. So if I understood you correctly, I think it relates to that as well. So I think that does have a great opportunity to help improve the labor risk challenge in our industry.
Yeah, so if anyone is interested in jumping on board with that model, maybe just put something in the chat room and I can follow up, but it's definitely, we see it as a win-win where the companies that supply the machines aren't losing anything because their machines are purchased and then taken off the floor and they put a new one there. And then companies want students that can use all of this, and the school can provide the teacher and the space. So it really is a win-win.
By the way, I noticed that somebody in the chat box asked about getting the presentation. So I'll make this available to ACI, and so that way they can send it out. It'll be in a PDF format because it's a little too big to email because of the graphics in it, but I'll make that available.
Thank you, Daniel. If you want to send that to me, I'll make sure that everyone gets that. And then I don't know if you noticed there was one question: how do we get owners and contractors together to advance the process?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. That's also obviously the challenge, and it's kind of a chicken and egg challenge, I suppose. In my opinion, as I mentioned at the outset of this, I think the owners have to be the ones that step up. They have to realize that what we're doing isn't working, and doing what we've always done is not getting the job done either. And so if we just take the step of measuring, we would find out so much that would begin to drive this change. And so that's really what we've been doing. The whole LRM model is pretty effective, but just the CWDA all by itself will take us so far down the road because it will allow that, it will allow visibility into the challenges that are in front of us. So that's what we are doing. We are talking to owners and saying, look, you don't have to jump into the deep end of the pool. Just wade in, put a toe in, just start getting contractors to complete the CWDA and looking at those scores, and you will see exactly where the challenges are and what kind of change is needed. And we can develop a roadmap pretty easily once you know what the challenge is, once you've measured it. And we're getting owners to respond to that. In fact, we're getting owners who are looking at actually putting it into their contract language. And obviously that's where it makes the most difference. It can't be optional. But while I think the owner has the leadership, I don't think they have the sole responsibility. Contractors have the ability to drive change on their own as well, particularly large contractors, GCs, EPCs, and so on, EPCMs. And so we are actually working with large contractors right now who've already completed and are using the CWDA score because they're confident in what they're doing. So they're getting a good score. And so they're using that score as a way of generating more business, bidding on work, showcasing themselves. And so contractors have the ability to accomplish a number of things here. One of them is evaluate where they are, benchmark themselves against the industry and peers, get recommendations for how to improve if they're not doing as well as they could be doing, and then using all that information in order to enhance their reputation and grow their business and get more projects, win more work. So contractors have the opportunity here to do the same thing. And so we encourage that. If you believe you have a good workforce development program and or you're looking to improve it, the CWDA is an easy way to do that, to measure that, and to be able to start changing not only your own internal program, but the industry as a whole. I answered all the questions, I think.
Dan, I have a question. George Sukuria here.
Yes.
Do we have forms to for the contractor to calculate the the LRM, LRI, and so on, and then do we have a way to promote these forms to the contractors?
You broke up a little bit. I don't know if I captured all that question. I apologize.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but some of the words got broken up, so I.
Oh, okay. Do we have any special forms for the contractors to fill to make it easy for them to calculate the LRM and the LRI and so on?
Well, okay. I misunderstood the word forms. No, there's not really a form per se. If that's something that you want to do, we can work through that process with you. It's all done through the online portal. So there's not, we could do it through, an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, but it's really designed to be done through the online portal. The CWDA is all done online. So that, that's where you go in and complete all of it. It does it all dynamically, and then you actually can use the online portal in order to share the scorecard with owners and contractors and so on. It can be done, you can share it externally as a PDF, but the whole process happens online.
I see. Thank you.
Daniel,
And if there's any challenge in doing that, we can easily help you through that. So there's no need to be concerned about the the process. We would help anybody through that.
Of course, the contractor, though, has to collect the information ahead of time about
correct.
how much they are spending on training, how much they have, about safety, about all that stuff, and combine that to make that index possible.
Yeah, that is a really good point. And for a contractor that may not have all of that, well organized or right at their fingertips, that can be a process that takes a little bit of time. But if you have it all there, it's considerably less of a challenge. The other thing too is the way it's structured is that the first time you do it, is the hardest time, particularly the CWDA. The first time you do it is the hardest. After that, it's a matter of updating it. So only the first time when you're collecting all the information, putting all that together, that is the one that takes a little bit more effort. After keeping it updated is not nearly the challenge.
That will lead me to the next suggestion. I'm professor at UC, retired professor at UC, University of Cincinnati, but I think it will be very helpful to publicize that at the education level in the construction management programs.
Oh, yeah.
To help direct the attention of the new managers to this process, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great idea. You know, and of course, we're always open to that level of communication, of course. But yeah, that's a great idea, because if we're going to be serious about it, then as new generations are coming into the marketplace, we ought to make sure they're prepared to do this type of thing. And by the way, to your point about forms, there's not a form per se, but in advance of it, we make clear these are the things that are needed in order to make this happen. So it's not as though you just go into the system and start typing and hope you have it all. I mean, you can prepare in advance.
But eventually there will be an index that will show up at the end as a number. And maybe that could become part of the pre-qualification of contractors, per se.
That's exactly what is intended to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's important to publicize it through the newly developed contractors,
That's
through
right.
the construction management program and so on.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Daniel, we have one last comment/question, and then out of respect for everyone's time, it just says, thank you, Daniel, for a great presentation. We've been hearing about this process for some time and would love to help spread the word. This is from Terry Phillips at ACI. One question, do you know of any owners in our tri-state area that is on board and ready to go?
So most of the work that we've been doing on this at this point is in the Gulf Coast area, industrial focused. So let me back up. No, I don't know of any in this tri-state area, so the ACI region. But that can happen pretty quickly. The fact that there are none doing that now, we have contractors we are talking to in this region who are interested, and we're in the process of getting started, but none have done it yet. In the Gulf Coast area, where there's obviously a lot of industrial work going on, we see that happening. And we are now, even in that Gulf Coast area, Texas, Louisiana in particular, we're starting to see, even on the, not just industrial, but on the commercial side, developers, hospitals, and so on, who are working toward implementation because they're seeing the same challenges. The challenges aren't just in the industrial space. It's also in all that non-industrial market as well.
Well, this is Anthony, and I guess, Daniel, we wanted to thank you. That was really excellent. ACI would love to keep engaging with you on this topic and see how we might work together to advance this very issue, which is so important to the industry, labor. I wanted to thank you again, and thank Bob Volkman for his introduction. Thank Erica and her team for all the marketing and planning that went into this. And thank all our guests today. So please stay tuned. And again, on behalf of ACI, thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.